The house was quiet that evening, the usual sounds softened by an unusual calm. She moved to the bathroom, escaping from the noise of her own thoughts. The bathroom had always been her sanctuary, a place to retreat, reflect, and pull herself back together. Tonight, though, her mind kept straying, restless and uncertain. She leaned against the counter, glancing at her reflection in the mirror, and caught herself wondering how she'd come to feel so isolated within her own life. She hadn't realized how much of herself she'd put away over the years. Her husband, once so attentive, now moved through their life together like a stranger. Words were sparse between them, and even when spoken, they felt empty, obligatory. She'd long stopped trying to bridge the distance, tired of seeking affection that was no longer there. Loneliness had become a familiar ache, something she'd adapted to quietly, accepting it as part of her marriage. But then he'd come back into her life. Her nephew, just starting adulthood, was no longer the boy she remembered from family gatherings. He was thoughtful, kind, with a smile that softened the weight in her chest. Their conversations had started innocently, polite exchanges that somehow grew longer and deeper. She found herself looking forward to their talks, the way he listened to her with genuine interest, something her husband rarely showed anymore. Tonight, she heard a soft knock at the door and turned. He stood there, hesitating, as though unsure if he should enter. She gave a small nod, a silent invitation. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him, and she felt the air change, thicker somehow, charged with an energy neither of them acknowledged. He stood there, hands in his pockets, glancing at her with that quiet concern that had become both a comfort and a temptation. "I didn't want to interrupt, but you seemed distant tonight. Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, laced with sincerity. She smiled faintly, a practiced expression that failed to reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she murmured, but her voice betrayed her. The words were weak, transparent, and he seemed to see right through them. He took a step closer, his presence steady and calming, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. "It's okay if you're not," he said gently. The simplicity of his words broke through her defenses, and she felt her composure slip. Her hand reached for the counter, fingers tightening on the edge. She hadn't realized how much she'd been holding in. "I don't know when it happened, but—" She hesitated, her voice softening, trailing off. The feelings she'd been avoiding, loneliness, confusion, and an inexplicable draw toward him, swirled to the surface, leaving her vulnerable. He didn't push, only stood there, close enough that she could sense his steady breath, his presence a quiet reassurance. She wanted to tell him everything, but words seemed pointless, inadequate. They shared a look, one that lingered longer than it should have, a silent acknowledgement of everything they weren't saying. She felt her pulse quicken, the tiny thrill of being seen, truly seen. His gaze held hers, and for a moment, the walls she'd built around herself trembled. She knew this was wrong, that the thoughts crossing her mind were a betrayal, but the pull between them was undeniable, something deeper than either of them could name. His hand moved, almost instinctively, brushing her arm with a gentle touch that sent warmth through her. It was a simple gesture, barely noticeable, yet it left a mark, awakening a longing she'd buried long ago. He stood beside her, quietly, as if waiting for her to continue, yet she found herself lost in the silence, the comfort of having someone who was simply there. She didn't know when it happened, this feeling that he understood her in a way that no one else did. There was no judgment in his gaze, only empathy, a gentleness she had missed in her life. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she said softly, almost to herself. She hadn't planned to say it, but the words slipped out, and once spoken, they felt raw and real. He listened, leaning in slightly, his attention unwavering. "It's okay to feel lost sometimes," he replied. "Life has a way of changing us without asking." His voice was calm, grounded, like he had more wisdom than his years should allow. There was a kindness there that felt like a balm, a way of making her feel understood without the need to explain everything. She glanced down, studying her hands, and for a moment, she was silent. Finally, she spoke again, letting the words come as they would. I used to think I had everything figured out, but lately, I feel like I'm just here, going through the motions. Her voice faltered, but he didn't look away, just nodded, giving her space to continue if she wanted. I get it, he said after a moment. Sometimes it feels like no one really sees us. His voice was barely above a whisper, and the vulnerability in his tone surprised her. She looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw a flicker of something familiar, a shared loneliness that mirrored her own. They were both searching, both lost in their own ways. Without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing his, a brief contact that felt like it carried an entire world of unspoken understanding. He didn't pull away, and she felt the warmth of his skin, the steady strength in his hand that felt somehow anchoring. "You ever feel like you're just drifting?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He nodded, his gaze intent, as if he was trying to tell her something without words. There was a sadness in his eyes, a depth that made her heart ache. "More than I'd like to admit," he replied. "I thought maybe it was just me." His words hung in the air, and she felt the weight of them, the honesty that bound them together in a way she hadn't expected. They were both carrying burdens, both hiding parts of themselves that no one else saw. Slowly, she pulled her hand back, the absence of his touch leaving a strange hollowness. She felt a pang of guilt, but it was mixed with a longing she couldn't ignore. There was a tenderness in him, a quiet understanding that filled the empty spaces in her life, even if only for a moment. They both looked away, each lost in their own thoughts, but the silence was filled with a kind of peace, an unspoken promise that they didn't have to pretend with each other. The connection between them was undeniable, a shared bond that had formed through unspoken confessions and subtle glances. It was both comforting and dangerous, a line they both knew they shouldn't cross. He reached over and gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, a simple gesture that felt like reassurance, and she felt a sense of warmth spread through her. It was the kind of touch that said, "I'm here," without needing words. She looked at him, a soft smile forming, and in that moment, she realized how much she had missed this. Missed feeling seen, feeling valued. The unspoken words between them lingered, the things they dared not say but both understood. They were both on the edge of something forbidden, something that would change everything, and yet, neither of them moved. The silence held everything they couldn't say, a fragile piece that felt like it could shatter at any moment. They stayed like that, in the quiet, sharing a space that felt like it belonged only to them, a sanctuary carved out of a stolen moment. And in that silence, she felt a strange sense of relief, as though, for the first time in a long while, she was exactly where she was meant to be. As they stood there, the air between them grew thick with unspoken words, a tension that neither could deny. She looked away, her heart pounding, a flush of guilt creeping in, yet the longing was stronger. She knew this was dangerous, that there were lines they shouldn't cross, but his presence filled a void that had been growing inside her for years. It was as if he understood her, the part of her she'd hidden from everyone, even herself. He took a small step closer, his eyes searching hers as if he was trying to find the right words. The intensity of his gaze sent a thrill through her, something she hadn't felt in so long that it almost felt foreign. She tried to pull back, to remind herself that this was wrong, but his hand reached out, just grazing her arm, and she felt a shiver run through her. His touch was gentle, tentative, yet it left her feeling both exposed and alive. "I don't know how we got here," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but he heard it, his eyes softening as he nodded. He looked at her with such understanding, as though he knew exactly what she was feeling. The silent connection between them grew stronger, more intense, and she could feel the unspoken words pressing at the edges, threatening to spill over. "I don't either," he said quietly, his voice filled with something she couldn't name, a mix of longing and restraint. They stood there, both caught in the moment, both aware of how far they'd come and how close they were to crossing that line. She could feel the pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw them closer together. something she knew was wrong but felt powerless to resist. He reached out again, his hand hovering just beside her cheek, a gesture so simple yet filled with meaning. She could feel his warmth, the steadiness of his breath, and for a moment, everything else faded away. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just them, a cocoon of shared emotion that shut out the rest of the world. She knew that if she moved even an inch, they'd be past the point of no return. Her heart hammered in her chest, the conflict raging inside her. Part of her wanted to pull away, to remember the promises she'd made, but the other part wanted to stay, to hold on to this feeling that had become so rare in her life. She closed her eyes, breathing in deeply, hoping it would ground her, help her find clarity. But instead, it only made the moment feel more intense, more real. "I can't do this," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. But she didn't pull away. She felt his hand lower, his fingers brushing hers, and the touch was electric, sparking something inside her that she'd thought had long since faded. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze once more, and the emotion she saw there was both comforting and terrifying. "Neither can I," he replied softly, but he didn't step back either. They both stood there, caught in the tension, aware of the consequences yet unable to move. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they weren't saying, and she realized that she didn't want this moment to end. The guilt gnawed at her, yet the feeling of being seen, of being understood, was too powerful to ignore. Their hands met, fingers intertwining for just a brief moment, and she felt her resolve weakening. She knew they were on the edge, balancing between what was right and what they both wanted. Her breath hitched as he held her gaze, and she could feel the heat in her cheeks, the mixture of fear and anticipation that left her feeling both exhilarated and lost. They stayed like that, hands just barely touching, as if testing the limits of their restraint. She wanted to move closer, to close the distance, but something held her back, a small voice reminding her of everything she stood to lose. Yet in that moment all she could think about was him, the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to understand her in a way no one else did. Finally, she let her hand slip from his, the loss of contact leaving her feeling strangely empty. She took a shaky breath, stepping back, trying to regain her composure. She saw the disappointment in his eyes, the sadness that mirrored her own, and for a brief moment, she wondered what might have happened if they'd let go of their reservations, if they'd crossed that line. But the moment had passed, leaving them both standing there, caught between desire and regret, each struggling with the choices they hadn't made. The silence between them was heavy, filled with a longing that neither of them could fully put into words, and she realized that this was something she would carry with her, a memory that would linger long after they'd both moved on. The silence in the room settled into a kind of ache, a quiet reminder of everything unsaid, of lines they had both skirted around but not dared to cross. She felt the weight of it, the pull of something unresolved that lingered between them like a whispered secret. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, feeling her pulse begin to calm, but the emotions swirling inside her remained tangled. He was still watching her, his eyes filled with questions he didn't ask. She sensed the hurt there, the uncertainty, and it stirred something deep within her. Part of her wanted to reach out, to explain herself, to apologize for the way they had drifted so close to something that felt forbidden. But what could she say? Words seemed meaningless now, an attempt to cover up what had already been felt so plainly. After a moment, he gave a small, sad smile and turned toward the door, as though accepting what they both knew, that this moment would have to end, that reality would intrude, pulling them back into their separate lives. She felt a pang as he reached for the door, an ache that was hard to ignore, but she stayed silent, knowing that whatever they'd shared would have to remain unspoken. Just as he touched the handle, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder, a question in his eyes. She met his gaze, and in that brief moment, she felt everything between them rise to the surface again, a tension that refused to fade. He seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for her to say something, to make a decision that would change everything. But she stayed silent, her hands trembling at her sides, torn between the life she'd built and the connection she felt so deeply. The door creaked open, and he stepped out, leaving her alone in the quiet, the emptiness settling around her like a shroud. She stood there, the remnants of their closeness lingering, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't silence. She wondered if she'd done the right thing, if letting him go was truly what she wanted, or if it was simply what she thought she should do. The lines between desire and duty blurred, leaving her stranded in the middle. As the minutes ticked by, the reality of her life came rushing back, filling the void he'd left behind. She thought of her husband, of the life they'd built together, and the hollow feeling that had come to define her days. She had chosen this path, and yet, standing there alone, she felt as if she'd given up a part of herself, a part that longed for something deeper, something real. In the days that followed, she found herself thinking of him constantly, of the way he'd looked at her, the understanding they'd shared. It haunted her, lingering in the quiet moments, in the spaces between conversations, a reminder of something that might have been. She knew it was wrong, that she shouldn't dwell on it, but it was as if a part of her had awakened, a part that couldn't simply be ignored. Whenever she saw him, their eyes would meet, and for a split second, it was as if they were back in that moment, sharing the weight of unspoken feelings. But they never talked about it, each choosing to carry the memory in silence, a quiet reminder of a connection they could never fully acknowledge. It became a secret between them, something woven into their interactions, a bond that neither could break yet neither could act upon. She returned to her routine, the familiar rhythm of her life, but something had shifted, a change that left her feeling out of place, as if she no longer fit in the life she'd built. Her husband's presence felt distant, almost foreign, and she found herself longing for the simplicity of that connection, for the feeling of being seen, of being understood. Over time, the ache dulled, settling into a quiet regret, a memory she would carry with her. She knew they'd made the right choice, that whatever had passed between them would remain a moment suspended in time, untouched by the outside world. But there were nights when she would lie awake, the silence pressing in, and wonder what might have happened if she'd let herself follow that pull, if she'd taken the risk. In the end, she knew she would never find the answer. She'd chosen the life she had, and as much as it left her with a sense of emptiness, she told herself it was the right choice. She had her family, her responsibilities, and that would have to be enough. Yet, as she stood in the quiet of her own thoughts, a part of her knew that something had been left unfinished, a piece of her heart that would always belong to that unspoken moment.